In this Elden Ring video, I'm going to be showing you my Mad King build. This is a level 150 plus build that can be used at the very end of endgame, as well as in New Game Plus. So let's talk a little bit about this build. This is a madness-focused build. This is sort of an evolution of the Frenzied Acolyte build with kind of a spin to it. We've changed one of the spells here. We've added a little bit of bleeding to this build as well, because if you weren't aware, bleeding and both madness scale off of the arcane stat depending on what you have equipped. For instance, if you're using Morgott's Curved Sword, which is the weapon we're using with this build, the bleed buildup will improve the more arcane you use, and if you're using the Dragon Communion Seal to cast spells, then you're casting Swarm of Flies, then the bleed buildup will actually be higher, and the madness buildup with your spells will actually be higher as well, because you are scaling off arcane. So they kind of tie together very nicely here. As I just mentioned, the weapon that I'm using for this build is Morgott's Curved Sword. A lot of people have been asking me for a build revolving around this weapon, and this is a curved greatsword. The damage on it is not exceptional, but it has a very unique weapon skill that is absolutely fantastic. What Cursed Blood Slice does is it sort of charges you forward, attacking, and then that attack sort of cuts through the air, leaves like a blood fire trail that then explodes and detonates, dealing fire damage, and also triggering the Blood Flame status effect on the enemy so that their bleed buildup doesn't get reduced. And you can follow this up with another L2 that adds another attack that does a similar thing. And what's really great about this weapon is it has blood loss buildup on it natively, so regular attacks and this ability are going to trigger blood loss pretty rapidly, and when you combine that with something like Swarm of Flies when using the Dragon Communion Seal that uses arcane scaling, you can trigger bleeding very, very easily. Beyond that weapon, we're also using the Dragon Communion Seal because, as I mentioned, we need arcane in order to increase the damage of Morgott's Cursed Sword and the bleed buildup. And this will also improve the efficacy of Swarm of Flies and the madness buildup that you get from the madness spells that we use as well. Although we're not really using the madness spells for the madness effect necessarily, it will help build up madness on enemies that can gain madness. And if you're PvPing, obviously, it will be more effective in PvP. I have both of these maxed out, but besides that, I have the Frenzied Flame Seal in my left hand. I haven't upgraded this at all, and you can use this to cast things like Golden Vow and Flame Grant Me Strength. But also it's going to boost the damage of our Frenzy spells by about 20%. So just having it in our offhand when we're casting those is going to increase our damage with those spells, which is excellent. When it comes to armor for this build, on the head I have the Silver Tier Mask. That's because this gives us 8 Arcane. That is a huge amount of Arcane. That's like 8 levels worth of Arcane, and at this point in the game, levels come a lot more slowly, so that's really good. And we have kind of a crazy stat spread for this build. We're using like 7 of the 8 attributes for this build, so getting any, attribute relief we can get is a must. This will reduce your physical damage by a little bit, but because Morgott's Curved Sword scales with Arcane anyway, it's not going to be as much as it could be. And besides that, I'm using the Veteran set for the other 3 pieces. It's not super important which one you use, but using a heavier armor set with Poise is going to make it so that you can get off the Cursed Blood Slice weapon skill more effectively, because you tend to get hit when you're using it on that second L2 pull depending on what enemy you're facing if you don't stagger them immediately. So it's good in order to get that, and it'll help you, be able to cast your madness spells without getting interrupted as well. When it comes to talismans for this build, I have the Fire Scorpion Charm, Ritual Sword Talisman, Dragon Crest Great Shield Talisman, and Shard of Alexander, but I do swap some of these around depending on, what I'm facing. The reason the Fire Scorpion Charm is very good for this build is because the Cursed Blood Slice, that trailing fire explosion, deals fire damage, which is great. And the 2 madness spells that we use for this build also deal fire damage, so you're going to boost the damage of those spells. Ritual Sword Talisman is great for this build because it's going to affect your regular damage, your weapon skill damage, and your spell damage. Anytime that you have a build that has you're using all different aspects of the build, whether it's regular attacks or your weapon skill or even 2 of these with spells, it's not a bad idea to use this talisman because it'll boost everything. You just have to remember to keep your health at full in order to gain the benefit of it. And because we do a lot of casting with this build, that's not typically a problem. Dragon Crest Great Shield Talisman is just good for giving you more protection. You already have pretty good protection with this build anyway, but you do have the Fire Scorpion Charm, which does reduce your protection a little bit. So this kind of shores that up and also gives you even more protection. So it makes you kind of tanky for like a hybrid caster type build. Shard of Alexander is going to boost Cursed Blood Slice damage by about 15%, which is phenomenal. This is the one that I'll sort of swap around. Sometimes I'll switch this out for Flock's Canvas Talisman if I know I'm going to be casting spells more than using this ability. So don't be afraid to switch this one around depending on what playstyle you're using at the moment. The spells that I use for this build are obviously Golden Vow, which increases your damage by 15%. This is your weapon skill, your regular attacks, and your spells, making it perfect for this build. It also increases your defenses, so you're even tankier. Flame Grant Me Strength is great because the damage you deal with Morgott's Cursed Sword is 100% physical, except when you use Cursed Blood Slice, and that trailing explosion deals fire damage, which then it buffs the physical and fire damage of that very, very effectively, so that's very good here. And also the, frenzy spells that we use are buffed by the fire damage buff of that, so that'll boost your spell damage as well, which is excellent. Swarm of Flies is very, very situational, and what I really like about this spell is it's not super expensive FP-wise, and it'll really help you get that bleed buildup on a target, where you can just kind of go into like a jump attack or something, or you can use Cursed Blood Slice, trigger Hemorrhage really, really fast, which is good. When it comes to the Frenzy spells I use for this build, I'm using Frenzied Burst, which is one that I used in the Frenzied Acolyte build, but we've swapped out the Flame of Frenzy here for Unendurable Frenzy. Frenzied Burst is like your super long-range sniper ability. This thing goes really, really far. It has very good single-target damage. You can charge it for even more damage and make it so that it penetrates enemies going through their shields, which is absolutely fantastic. You can generally one-shot most enemies with this very easily, and if you charge it, you can one-shot like semi-difficult enemies with it as well, or maybe two-shot difficult enemies from range. So it's very, very good. It has a very high FP cost at 24, although that's not terrible for what you can do with it. And it's just one of those spells that's just awesome. If you are playing any sort of incantation build in this game, this is a spell you should have in there, whether you're frenzy focused or not. And then, as I mentioned, we've swapped out the Flame of Frenzy for Unendurable Frenzy. And what this spell allows you to do is hold down the casting button and just continuously spew fire. Like, as long as you have FP, this thing's going to keep spewing fire in front of you, and you can walk around when you do it, which allows you to keep the spacing on enemies, particularly if they're mildly aggressive. You're not going to be able to keep holding this against super aggressive enemies that are charging at you. But if you can walk backward away from enemies that are, kind of walking towards you, you can keep spewing this as long as you can maintain your FP. And because you have really good poise with this setup of armor, you can usually tank like one hit before you're going to get interrupted by a second hit, allowing you to just keep spewing fire and just dealing continual damage to enemies. Even using this on something like the Fire Giant is absolutely effective, even though he's resistant to fire damage, because you just spew damage so fast with it. And something interesting that I really like to do with this is I like to use the Cerulean Hidden Tier when I go into a boss fight, and basically give me infinite FP for like 10 seconds. So when you start a boss fight, you go in and you just lead with this, and for that 10 seconds, you're not chewing any of your FP, and then when it expires, you start going through your FP pool. And if you have a big FP pool, it's going to take you a while to drain it. I don't even worry about the madness buildup on this on myself because it takes so long. And even if madness triggers on yourself, it's not the end of the world. And you can just absolutely melt bosses or difficult enemies with this if you position yourself correctly. So generally the way this build works is that I'll pick off like individual enemies with like jumping R1s and R1 follow-ups that are spaced out. And then maybe pick off more difficult enemies with Frenzied Burst from long range, using charged attacks to try and one-shot them when possible. If they're not aware that I'm there, you get that extra damage when they're not aware. That usually helps you just absolutely wipe out anything that, is dangerous at all. And then, when I get to like bosses and like, very difficult enemies, I'll usually use like Swarm of Flies, trigger bleeding if I feel like that's a better way to go. Some enemies are very weak to bleeding, some are more resistant. Otherwise, I'll use Unendurable Frenzy, and I'll just try and melt them really quickly. Or, depending on, if I don't feel like I can hold that down, I'll use Cursed Blood Slice and just try and pound them real quickly with that. Cursed Blood Slice typically staggers a lot of enemies when you charge into them, and when you do the follow-up, it also does like a little bit. So you can usually get off 2 L2 presses, but sometimes you have trouble getting that, if you want to do 2 L presses again, sometimes there's a little gap there. You may need to dodge away and then press it again, depending on what the enemy is doing. Or you can, throw out Swarm of Flies after you do that and try and trigger Hemorrhage and then finish them off that way. So when it comes to attributes for this build, I have sort of a crazy stat spread for this, and I feel like this is what really makes this build an NG plus build rather than an NG build, although you can use it a little bit at the end of the game. I have 50 Vigor, 30 Mind, 28 Endurance, 14 Strength, 35 Dexterity, 9 Intelligence, 31 Faith, and 45 Arcane. Out of all the builds I've made so far, I don't think I've seen a build that has some investment in 7 different stats, making this extremely stat hungry, but it also makes this build more and more effective as you go into NG Plus and go into NG++ because you have so much room to grow with this build. With Vigor, 50 is really good for this build. You have lots of protection. I know people are like, only 50 Vigor, but you literally have like 50% or higher, maybe even 60% protection with this build. So that's not bad at all. You're going to increase Vigor as you go through NG Plus and NG Plus Plus, obviously probably up to 60 or 65, but I wouldn't prioritize it at this point. Mind is at 30 here, and honestly, I wish this were higher. Golden Vow is expensive. Flame Grant Me Strength is moderately expensive. Swarm of Flies isn't, but the 2 Frenzy spells that we use for this build are expensive. Cursed Blood Slice is expensive. So you're going to use lots of FP with this build, and getting your mind up to like 35 or 40 to a point where you don't really have to worry about your FP as much would be great. So I recommend as you go through NG+, prioritizing a little bit, getting your mind up to 35, maybe 40, before you start worrying about increasing your damage much. Endurance is at 28 in order to allow us to medium roll with this high protection and high poise. Depending on what armor set you're using, this will be higher or lower. Stamina is not really an issue for this build, so you don't really need endurance for stamina. It's really in order to be able to medium roll with whatever armor set you're using. I like one with high poise, but maybe there's one with more protection you want to use and you need to increase this into NG Plus and NG Plus Plus, or maybe you don't mind having lower poise because you're not really getting interrupted anyway. You can probably reduce this, and that would eliminate some of the heavy stat spread. Strength 14 is simply there for the requirement for Morgott's Cursed Sword, and 35 Dexterity is also there for the requirement for it. I would really love to have higher Dexterity for this build because the weapon scales very high off Dexterity, and as you go into NG Plus and NG Plus Plus, you're going to keep increasing Dexterity at some point to get more damage out of your regular attacks and out of Cursed Blood Slice. What's really amazing with this build is that you're already very effective even with only 35 Dexterity, so as you increase that all the way up to 80 through NG Plus and NG Plus Plus, you're going to be able to increase your damage, more and more, which will allow you to keep up with the difficulty of NG Plus and NG Plus Plus, giving you a really, really high ceiling with your melee weapon. We need 31 Faith in order to meet the requirement and in order to use Unendurable Frenzy, but if you're not using Unendurable Frenzy and you decide you like the Flame of Frenzy better, which some people do, you can drop this down a bit. This will also increase your incantation damage because the Dragon Communion Seal scales with Arcane and Faith, although Faith to a much lesser extent. So we do get some other benefit out of it other than just meeting the requirement. But also having at least 25 Faith allows us to use Golden Vow, which is a very, very good buff as well. And lastly, I have 45 Arcane. The reason for 45 Arcane is it's sort of the sweet spot for the Dragon Communion Seal in terms of its incantation scaling, but also it increases the damage of Morgott's Cursed Sword. Not as good as Dexterity, obviously, but it also improves the Blood Loss buildup, which is good too. So because you're getting incantations scaling out of it, and you're getting damage and blood loss buildup, I prioritized it over Dexterity for the weapon, only meeting the requirements of Dexterity for the weapon, because you get more out of it, I think, as a whole for this build. But if you were just making a build that only focused on Morgott's Cursed Sword, or just Cursed Blood Slice, you would probably, not take Arcane up this high early on and prioritize Dexterity to get more damage before increasing Arcane higher later. And as far as Arcane goes, you're going to want to increase this up to 50 at some point in NG+. This is sort of like the soft cap for Morgott's Cursed Sword on Arcane. You're already past that on the Dragon Communion Seal, so you probably don't want to go too much higher than that. But what you're probably going to want to do is go, 5 to 10 points in Mind, 5 points in Arcane, and then starting to increase Dexterity to get your melee damage up, and maybe sprinkle some points in Vigor in there if you feel like you need it. If not, that's fine. Once you have Vigor where you want, you have Mind up to about 40, and you have Arcane at 50. Dexterity, you're going to want to increase to 80. Once that's at 80, you're going to start prioritizing probably Faith and Strength, depending on, whether you're using incantations more or you want more melee damage. But that's like into NG plus 3 or something like that, so that's way down the road. But that kind of gives you a roadmap of the build. And just some final tips for this. As I mentioned, if you're using the Flask of Wonders physique, you're going to want the Flame Shroud and Crack tier to increase your fire damage. This is going to boost the damage with your spells and also with Cursed Blood Slice. And you want to use the Cerulean Hidden tier in order to be able to use Unendurable Frenzy and just hold it down and deal tons of damage at the beginning of a boss fight. And when it comes to, what Great Rune you want to use, obviously Godric's is the best here. That'll give you 5 in every attribute. You use 7 of the 8 of these attributes. And if you have this active all the time, you can even drop Faith down to like 26. You could drop Dexterity down to 30. You could drop Strength down to 9 if you want, and Endurance down to 23. That would give you a lot more skill points in order to put into like Arcane, in order to Dexterity, in order to Mind, etc. But that's if you're using this all the time. But if not, you'll just have extra on top of that, which is good as well. That wraps up our Mad King build. I hope you guys liked it. I know a lot of people were clamoring for another Madness build. I'm going to try and get one more weapon video out to you guys before I go to Gamescom, so hopefully that'll be coming out next week while I'm at Gamescom. And during the Gamescom week next week, you'll probably see intermittent videos about updates of games that we're seeing at Gamescom. So Elden Ring content will probably slow down besides that video next week, and then it'll pick up again when I get back.